Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. And the sermons do change between now and Sunday. The setting is quite a bit different because I'm on stage. We just added a new microphone, so maybe the quality of this audio on Sunday will be a little bit better. My Sunday sermons aren't on this channel. My Sunday sermons are on the church channel. Last week, I asked the question, how would your life be if you lived a sinless life? And we looked a little bit at like Job. Would you be fabulously wealthy like Job? Would you be a social justice warrior like Job? Would you be religiously scrupulous like Job? And here I found this picture of a house, this beautiful mansion with a pool. It's got a landing strip with a private plane and a helicopter, a guest house for friends and parties. Would karma work for you if you lived a perfect life? Would all of your good deeds be rewarded? Could you work karma to your own advantage? And we sort of ended with the question, how does that work in this world? Because this little picture that I grabbed, I found on the internet, a mansion surrounded by slums in Angola. Even if your karmic plan worked, wouldn't you be living in a broken world? You'd need a wall to sort of protect your mansion. You'd want air purifiers the next time the California forests decide to burn and make our air brown. You'd want air conditioning because the climate is heating up, and you'd want armed guards to protect you from thieves and kidnappers because if you're fabulously wealthy, people tend to kidnap you or your children. Now, the world is a very large and strange place. Here's another picture of, and obviously I was looking for mansions in the middle of slums in the third world, and here's one where 15 millionaire mafia mansions owned by infamous kingpins, likely the children of the kingpin. They're enjoying the pool overlooking the massive slum. Or, and I noticed, because I looked at the Taj Mahal, because the Taj Mahal is basically a tomb created for someone's wife, and it's not necessarily surrounded by everything else that looks like the Taj Mahal. And then I discovered that tourism in India's slums is now surpassing tourism to the Taj Mahal. Think about that. This world is a very large and strange place. Now, most of our righteous efforts will be judged by future generations. Righteous Job undoubtedly owned slaves. One of Abraham Lincoln's social justice plans involved sending former slaves back to Africa. Didn't think through the fact that after just one generation, or even just a decade or two, the slave trade stopped a number of years before the Civil War. They weren't really Africans anymore. This was the only land they ever knew. This was the only language they ever knew. And so the whole Liberia project pretty much failed. Martin Luther King Jr. had a serious Me Too problem. Gandhi slept between two underage nieces. Human beings have a really hard time maintaining righteousness. And you think, well, we now know. Well, 300 years from now, you may be judged by future moral athletes for owning a car, for using plastic, for using electricity from fossil fuels, or maybe taking waters from dams that kill fish. Who knows what you're going to be judged against in 300 years? But be of good cheer. The odds are that you personally, or me personally, will not be remembered at all as individuals. They'll just look back us and say, oh, those car-driving, plastic-using, electricity and water-using people of the 21st century, they really ruined the world. I'm glad I'm not like them. Now, today's parable is one of the clearest parables that Jesus ever spoke. And as Kenneth Bailey, whose commentary that I've been using, he wrote his commentary during the Lebanese Civil War, notes that the story of the rich man and Lazarus is what he calls a pearly gate story. And there are a lot of these stories rolling around in oral tradition and various storytelling traditions in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim places in the Near East, and these things continue today. The focus on the story isn't necessarily the details of the afterlife, but more the relationship on how the afterlife and this world relate today. And this very famous parable of Lazarus and the rich man is no different. Now a certain man was rich and dressed in purple cloth and fine linen, feasting sumptuously every day. Now, we might not pick up on the little details of this, but purple cloth was enormously expensive. This was a member of the 1%. And so he dressed well, and he feasted sumptuously every day, which meant that he didn't fast like a good religious Jew would. He is certainly no Job. He might be wealthy like Job, but he is not righteous like Job. And in a minute, we'll see how not only isn't he scrupulous in terms of his religious observance, but he's not terribly scrupulous in terms of how he treats the poor around him. A certain poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, lay at his gate. And Kenneth Bailey goes into fairly great detail about certain practices regarding beggars and begging. In all likelihood, the people of the town knew this beggar for quite a few years. Actually, right before this, I was thinking about Billy, who lives sort of in the corner of the church lot. And I was thinking about the fact that he's been out there for almost a year now. And, yeah. So, these things get complicated. But basically, the people of the village likely put Lazarus out there and hoping that this rich man, because probably the only one who'd have the resources to do anything for this man who was probably dying, covered with sores, but the rich man does nothing. And he was longing to be filled with what fell from the table of the rich man. Now, if you know the story of the Canaanite or the Syrophoenician woman, there's a very famous story where Jesus makes a metaphor about dogs, and Jesus continues to get heat for that metaphor. You just have to search that on the internet and you'll find out. And this Lazarus can't even get in there. And even the dogs came up and licked his wounds. Now, Kenneth Bailey says that this is probably not the dogs adding insult to injury. This is probably the dogs even showing mercy on Lazarus, who was below the dogs. Now, Lazarus is the only person who gets a name in any of Jesus' major parables. Notice the rich man doesn't get a name, but Lazarus gets a name. And why would Jesus name Lazarus? Well, what does the name Lazarus mean? It means the one helped by God. And right there, all of us who are sort of a light touch when it comes to the problem of evil should sort of say, God surely didn't seem to be helping him very much. Well, let's keep going with the story. Now remember, this is a pearly gates story. The conceits and complexities of this world are brushed aside in order to reveal some truths and hidden complexities of the relationship. Now it happened that the poor man died, and he was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. And the rich man died and was buried. Now notice, it doesn't basically say that the poor man, his body was carried by the angels, but the man's soul, or it's rather mysterious. The rich man, however, died and was buried. And in Hades, he lifted up his eyes as he was in torment and saw Abraham from a distance and Lazarus at his side. They're both in the afterlife. And he called out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus so that he could dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am suffering pain in this flame. Now, there's a number of interesting things here. First of all, he who paid absolutely no attention to Lazarus seems now to know his name and still feels sufficient to order him around. And he doesn't even address Lazarus. He addresses Abraham. It seems to be an issue of status going on here. But Abraham said, child. Now, this is interesting, too, because we might say Abraham would be all hot and bothered and self-righteous about the rich man who did nothing and is now deserving his time in the flaming places of Hades. But Abraham isn't like that. And neither is Lazarus. They're not bitter. They're not angry. Abraham said, child, remember that you received your good things during your life, and Lazarus likewise bad things. But now he is comforted here, but you are suffering pain. So, is Lazarus' name good, helped by God? Certainly seems so at this point. The story is obviously about a great reversal. And in addition to all these things, a great chasm has been established between us and you, so that those who want to cross over from here to you are not able to do so, nor can they cross over from there to us. Abraham and Lazarus are not indignant, simply matter of fact. And one might add that this probably mirrors how the rich man saw the poor man. It's not a lot I can do. So he said, "Then I ask you, Father, that you send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, so that he might warn them, in order that they should not come down to this place of torment." Now, the rich man seems to have learned something, but not a whole lot. Lazarus has been helped by God, but in the afterlife, and his own family, well, good sons don't lose their father's inheritance, and the rich man didn't, but here, this is where the rich man is in mortal peril for his indifference to the suffering of Lazarus. Send Lazarus, he still hasn't learned, to warn them. Poor Lazarus continues to be the errand boy. Lazarus, who you actually had to step over in the previous life. It's also interesting to note that the rich man has 5 brothers. And again, this is a parable. Why this detail? Well, the rich man plus his 5 brothers makes 6 sons. Remember, Job had 7 sons. If the rich man had treated Lazarus like a brother, he would have had 7 sons. So 6 is an evil number for the Hebrews. Now, Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets. They must listen to them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." And you almost wonder if Dickens got this idea. But he said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone rises from the dead." Now, I just had a men's Bible study where we looked at Mary from Bethany, and often the question comes up, why isn't Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, in the 3 synoptic Gospels? It's only in the Gospel of John. Now, this is very interesting because, well, it's almost as if Lazarus is here, because Lazarus comes back from the dead in the Gospel of John, and that's intimately connected with the determination of those who wanted to kill Jesus to get the job done. It appears like someone coming back from the dead won't necessarily have the outcome that the rich man expects it will. Do we believe someone who came back from the dead? Could the rich man have rescued Lazarus? Well, that's kind of a difficult question. Could the rich man have rescued every Lazarus? What is this story about? Job was a righteous man. He was religiously scrupulous, and he was scrupulous with respect to his social justice. And we read about that last week. This man was, in fact, indifferent. And so, well, he lived in absolute wealth. He was a 1%er in the midst of a very struggling world. Now, we've been paying a lot of attention to Jesus' culture war, and I've been admonishing us to look at Jesus as a model for how we deal with our own cultural conflicts around us. But we should point out the fact that Jesus, in fact, sort of loses the culture war. Jesus is not able to stop the headlong rush to the disastrous rebellion that the Jews will mount to try to purify their land of the Roman Empire. Jesus will weep over Jerusalem and say, "I can't stop you from your self-destruction." Even the Son of God can't seem to stop them. The struggle between Rome and the Jews' desire for cultural, religious, and political autonomy will boil over in 67 AD in a disastrous war that the Jews will lose, and the temple will be destroyed. And here in the triumphant arch of Titus, you can see the menorah that was hauled through the streets of Rome as We taught them a lesson. Jesus would lose the culture war. The Jews would lose the culture war. God's chosen people, God will help, didn't seem to help the Jews. God will not rescue the Jews from their political poverty as compared to Rome. But Rome, too, will fall. Now, it's often said that these are God's chosen people. And others have noted that if this is what chosenness looks like, please choose somebody else. The climax of Hebraic power seemed to be the Davidic and Solomon's kingdom, which was a little small empire. They were able to master sort of the client states and the other vassal states around them. But after the death of Solomon, the nation was divided in two, and the two kingdoms fought against each other and tried to hold their own and had some degree of success, while the major powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia were weak. But once they, in fact, were able to reassert their dominance, the little nation didn't stand a chance. And in 586 BC, of course, the first temple was destroyed, and they went into Babylonian captivity. Cyrus came and sent a remnant back to rebuild the temple, but they remained vassals as part of the Persian Empire. And the Persians were replaced by the Greeks. There was a Maccabean revolt between 167 and 160 BC, which was successful, and there was a Hasmonean dynasty between 140 and 37, where they were sort of semi-autonomous. They were always small and always weak, and even when they were in charge of their own culture and land, the situation was not what the prophets had said it should be, when a temple would be rebuilt and when a Messiah would come, and where their people would be carried on the shoulders of the nations, and the whole world would be theirs. In 37 BC, Rome finally took full control, and for the most part, the great empires of the world have had control over that piece of territory really until 1948, and the British established a new homeland, and war immediately proceeded, and today the Jewish state is always embroiled in the Palestinian question. Why fight a culture war like Jesus if Jesus loses the culture war? We probably would rather our messiahs stay uncrucified. Shouldn't we want to win our culture war? Well, think about that. Can you actually imagine what that might look like? Can you really get concrete, no matter which side of this little battle you're on? What would it really look like to win? And would winning endure? Aren't there important public justice issues? Absolutely. Aren't there important personal morality issues? Absolutely. Shouldn't... there's a typo. Show me any culture war victory in history that hasn't been swallowed up by the age of decay. I was talking to some Roman Catholics who were talking about John Paul II. When John Paul II came in power and the Berlin Wall fell, of course, he was a pope from Poland, and they thought, now, finally, we and our regime will be in charge of the Roman Catholic Church. Many of those who love John Paul II aren't necessarily happy with Pope Francis. Many who love Pope Francis see it as, well, finally, the moderates or the progressives are more in charge of the church. And back and forth they go. But I want to ask you the question of what war was Jesus really fighting? And is that war over? Now, Jesus seems to have a very strange strategy. In Luke 9, Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem, where he will be taken back to heaven. A mob gathers around him in hopes to be part of history, but Jesus has no faith in the mob and refuses to wield them. The good people invite him to dinner, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and Jesus doesn't tell them what they'd like to hear, but he does in fact eat with them, which gives a degree of approval. But then we notice that Jesus is eating with the other side too, and the Pharisees and the religious authorities don't like that. And so they criticize him for eating with the bad people, eating with the collaborators with the Roman imperialists. Now remember what we talked about last week about the 1960s inversion. The parable of the prodigal son, the older brother, the righteous one, doesn't seek reconciliation between the father and the sinners. The father loves both evil sons, and they're both evil in their own way, who rebel against him in their own ways, and they themselves seem to be blind, well, at least one of them, to his rebellion. In Luke 16, you have the parable of the dishonest steward, which is one of Jesus' most subtle parables, and I really like Ken Bailey's interpretation of it, although I know every time I preach on that, I get a lot of comments about, I don't think you're reading that parable right. Basically, the dishonest steward is rewarded because he does not trust in his own righteousness, because he knows he has none, and he trusts in the zeal of the king for the king's righteousness. And then we have some other things in Luke 16 until we get to this parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which just seems to be about money and sharing with the poor and doing all those good things. But it's in a context, and in its context for a reason. In Luke 16, there are more battles. In verses 10 through 13, you can't serve God and mammon. In verses 14 and 15, he calls out the Pharisees for being lovers of money. In verses 16 and 17, there's a very strange passage about John the Baptist and people forcing their way into the kingdom that scholars have really yet to come to some kind of consensus with. Verse 18, you have a verse about men don't escape adultery by using the legality of divorce, and then we have the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And we almost always read the parable of the rich man in isolation to all of this flow that comes through. But why would Luke write this in this way? It's all part of a reason. Why does the parable of the rich man get connected with these other issues? Now, we live with the global and the private at the same time. And usually what we do is sort of task switch back and forth. And here Jesus pretty much puts them together. You have all of these culture war parables and sayings, and then you get this thing that seems to just be about money and privacy. But they wouldn't have heard it in that way. Here's the thing. Jesus will lose his culture war. The rich man loses his soul. Lazarus seems to not be helped by God. You will lose almost all of your battles, even when you are right. And what can shake us out? Of course, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, and that moment where Gandalf squares off against the Balrog costs Gandalf his life. And the War of the Ring is not concluded by this battle. We have all of this public stuff going on, and we have all of this private stuff going on, and we wonder about public social justice and private morality, and does any of it really matter? This world and its foe are too large for you, was too large for Job. Even Jesus can't stop his people from their course of self-destruction. If you would imagine, well, who would you send in to try to talk them out of it? They don't listen to Jesus. If they won't listen to the Son of God and Son of Man, will they listen to anyone? Your battles look small and pointless. He who is entrusted with much will be rewarded with much. He who fails what they do with little won't be entrusted with much more than what they were given. Lazaruses are always going to die, poor and beleaguered. It would have been a much better story if the rich man had done what he could for Lazarus, but by the way Jesus sets up that story, it doesn't appear he will. Now it's obvious the payload of the story about, well, don't just walk over the homeless or the beggar. But in many of my attempts to help the homeless and the beggars, I don't seem to be able to intervene and get them off the street. Lazaruses are always going to die poor and beleaguered, and guess what? The rich man, too. Those people with whom you have this death grip culture war, they're all heading to the grave in the age of decay. And the irony is that if you don't believe there's any afterlife, there's kind of a shrug. The rich man gets away with it, doesn't it? And Lazarus is not helped by God. But if someone from the dead goes to them, then they will listen. Well, it seems like Ebenezer Scrooge listens to the ghosts of Christmas past and present and future and mends his ways. Ebenezer Scrooge, it appears, would prove Abraham wrong. Lazarus comes out of the tomb, and they just want to kill Jesus more. Here's the question. Will we listen to one who came back from the dead? That maybe is the question that this parable is really asking us.